There was a time when Charles Ponzi was seen as a financial genius. Massive returns in a matter of weeks, with little to no risk. And somehow, he delivered. Early investors got paid exactly what they were promised, and word spread fast. Soon, thousands of people were lining up to give him their money, convinced they had found a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But what no one realized was that those profits weren't coming from any real investment. They were coming from other people. And the entire operation, every dollar, every promise, every success story, was built on a lie that was destined to collapse. Long before the headlines, the money, and the scandal, Charles Ponzi was just a kid growing up in Italy. On paper, his family wasn't poor. They had stability, respect, and a decent life. But that wasn't the version of reality Ponzi saw. What stuck with him wasn't what they had, it was what they had lost. Generations before him had been far more successful. Wealth, status, influence, all of it had slowly disappeared by the time he was born. And that contrast stayed in his head, because while he lived a normal life, he was constantly reminded that things used to be better, that he was supposed to have more. As he got older, that idea started to turn into something else: frustration, then resentment, and eventually, a quiet obsession with wealth. After his father passed away, he received a small inheritance, not enough to make him rich, but more than enough to give him a head start. It could have been the foundation for something stable. The problem is, stability was never what he was looking for. Instead of investing in his future, he spent the money trying to imitate a lifestyle he couldn't afford. He dressed well, ate in expensive places, and surrounded himself with people who lived the kind of life he believed should have been his from the start. For a brief period, it worked, at least on the surface, but that illusion didn't last long. Once the money was gone, there was nothing left to sustain it. And without education, discipline, or any real work experience, Ponzi found himself forced into the kind of jobs he had always looked down on. He moved constantly, taking whatever work he could find, but never managing to stay in one place for long. Sometimes he left on his own. Other times he was dismissed, but the result was always the same. He couldn't hold on to anything. In several of the jobs he took, Ponzi didn't just struggle, he tried to outsmart the system. He would cut corners, mislead customers, and look for small ways to take advantage of situations for his own benefit. It wasn't anything massive at first, but it showed a pattern. Whenever there was a chance to get ahead without doing the work, he took it. And over time, those choices escalated. At one point, while working in Canada, he stole a blank check from a company and filled it out himself, hoping to walk away with easy money. It wasn't a huge amount, but it didn't matter. He was caught almost immediately and sent to prison. It should have been a turning point. Instead, it became part of a pattern. Even after being released, nothing really changed. He continued drifting between jobs, trying different business ideas, none of which worked. Each failure reinforced the same reality. Traditional paths weren't getting him anywhere close to the life he wanted, and at some point, that frustration stopped being temporary. It became his mindset. Ponzi wasn't just failing. He had started to believe that the system itself didn't work for him. And if that was true, then maybe the answer wasn't to play the game better, but to find a way around it. While going through his mail one day, he came across a letter from overseas. Inside it was something he had never seen before: an international reply coupon, a prepaid voucher that could be exchanged for postage stamps in different countries. It was a simple tool, commonly used for international correspondence, and for most people, it wouldn't have meant much. But Ponzi looked at it differently. He started thinking about how these coupons were priced in different currencies depending on the country they were bought in, while still being redeemable for the same value elsewhere. In theory, that opened the door to a basic financial concept known as arbitrage: buying something where it's cheaper and selling it where it's worth more. On paper, the idea made sense. If he could buy large quantities of these coupons in countries where the currency had weakened, and then redeem them in the United States for a higher value in stamps, there was a small profit to be made on each transaction. And if that process could be repeated at scale, those small profits could add up quickly. It was the kind of idea that didn't just promise profit, but credibility. And more importantly, it gave him something he had never really had before: a story people could believe in. What he didn't fully accept, or chose to ignore, was that the margins were far too small and the logistics far too complicated for it to ever work at the scale he imagined. But by that point, that detail almost didn't matter anymore, because the idea itself was convincing enough. He began planning how to scale the operation, imagining networks of people buying these coupons overseas and sending them back to the United States. In his mind, it was just a matter of execution. But once he started looking at the details more closely, the cracks became impossible to ignore. The profit on each transaction was far smaller than he had expected, and the costs involved, shipping, coordination, time, quickly ate into whatever margin was left. Even if everything worked perfectly, the returns would be minimal. And worse than that, there simply weren't enough coupons in circulation to support the kind of operation he had envisioned. And that's where everything shifted. Instead of abandoning the idea, Ponzi realized that even if it didn't work in practice, it still had something extremely valuable. It was convincing. To most people, it sounded complex, international, and difficult to verify. And that meant he didn't actually need the system to function. He only needed people to believe that it did. From that point on, the logic changed completely. Rather than generating profits through the coupons themselves, he began using the idea as a narrative to attract investors. The promises became more ambitious, built on a system that existed only in theory, and as money started coming in, he found a simple way to maintain the illusion by using funds from new investors to pay the earlier ones. What had started as a failed business attempt quietly evolved into something far more effective, a structure that didn't rely on real profitability, logistics, or even feasibility, but on trust, and on a constant flow of people willing to believe. That's how the scheme was born. He began offering terms that no legitimate business would ever promise, returns of 50% in just 45 days, or even 100% in 90. On paper, it sounded absurd, but in practice, it was exactly what people wanted to hear. And because the first investors were paid on time, exactly as promised, doubt quickly turned into confidence. That early success created momentum. People who had already received their returns reinvested, convinced they had found something extraordinary, and many of them brought others with them. Word spread rapidly, not through advertising or institutions, but through trust. Friends told friends, families convinced each other, and before long, the demand started to grow beyond anything Ponzi could have predicted. Crowds began forming outside his office, with people waiting for hours just for the chance to hand him their money. It didn't feel like a risk anymore. It felt like an opportunity that couldn't be missed. The more people invested, the more legitimate the operation appeared, and that perception only attracted even more money. At the center of it all, Ponzi was no longer struggling. He was thriving, and for a moment, it worked perfectly. The system kept feeding itself, growing larger with every new investor, every success story, every person convinced they were part of something real. It was the peak of the illusion, a moment where everything looked stable, successful, and unstoppable, even though, underneath it all, nothing had actually changed. The money still wasn't coming from any real investment. It was just moving from one person to another. But as long as no one questioned it, the rise continued. The real turning point came when the press decided to take a closer look. A major Boston newspaper, which had previously contributed to Ponzi's growing reputation, began investigating his business in detail. This time, instead of repeating his claims, they brought in financial experts to analyze the numbers behind his operation. One of them calculated that, for Ponzi's explanation to be true, he would have needed to control an almost impossible volume of international reply coupons, far more than actually existed worldwide. That alone raised serious doubts. At the same time, reporters started digging into Ponzi's past and uncovered a history that had been conveniently hidden from the public. Previous arrests, time in prison, and a pattern of questionable behavior all started to come to light. The image of a financial genius began to crack. As these findings were published, the effect was immediate. Public confidence, which had been the foundation of the entire operation, began to collapse. Investors who had once trusted him completely now started to panic. Instead of lining up to invest, people rushed to withdraw their money, fearing they would be the last ones left. And that shift changed everything. Authorities, who had been cautious at first, now had enough reason to act. Investigations intensified, his financial records were examined, and it quickly became clear that there was no real investment behind the operation. Banks connected to his operation began to fail under the pressure. Thousands of people lost their savings, and Ponzi himself was arrested and charged with multiple counts of fraud. What had once looked like a revolutionary financial system was exposed for what it really was. Ponzi was arrested and formally charged with fraud, facing dozens of accusations tied to the operation he had built. Given the scale of the damage and the number of people affected, the expectation was that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. But the outcome was far less severe than many anticipated. Through a legal agreement, he ended up pleading guilty to a single charge and received a relatively short federal sentence. For someone responsible for ruining thousands of lives, it was a surprisingly light punishment. But prison didn't change him. After serving his time, Ponzi was released back into the world with the same mindset that had led him there in the first place. Instead of stepping away from fraud, he returned to it almost immediately, this time attempting a new scheme involving land deals in Florida. He promised investors even higher returns than before, claiming he could deliver extraordinary profits in a matter of weeks. The problem was that the land he was selling had little to no real value. Unlike before, people were far more cautious. The reputation he had built was now working against him, and it didn't take long for authorities to expose the new operation. Once again, he found himself facing legal consequences, this time with fewer options and less public sympathy. As his situation deteriorated, Ponzi tried to escape the consequences altogether. He attempted to leave the country and return to Italy, but was recognized and arrested before he could disappear. What followed was more time in prison, and by the time he was finally released, whatever remained of his reputation, influence, and connections had completely disappeared. In the end, Ponzi's story didn't conclude in wealth or redemption, but in obscurity. He spent his final years in poverty, far removed from the image he had once created for himself, and eventually ended up in Brazil, where he died in a charity hospital with no money, no status, and no real legacy beyond the scheme that carried his name. A man who built everything on illusion ended his life with nothing real left.